John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, assumed office in January 1961 at a moment when the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union had entered one of its most intense and dangerous phases. The world was divided into two ideological camps: capitalist democracy led by the United States and communist socialism led by the Soviet Union. Each side feared the expansion of the other and believed that any gain by its rival meant a corresponding loss to itself. Nuclear weapons had transformed this rivalry into an existential threat, because any direct military conflict between the two superpowers risked escalating into a nuclear war that could destroy civilization itself. Kennedy entered the presidency young, charismatic and idealistic, but also with limited experience in foreign policy and international crisis management. Early events, such as the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, in which U.S.-backed Cuban exiles attempted unsuccessfully to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government, damaged Kennedy's reputation and emboldened Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. The Bay of Pigs failure convinced Khrushchev that Kennedy might be weak and indecisive, and it pushed Cuba further into the Soviet camp. Fidel Castro, fearing another U.S. attempt to remove him, sought stronger military protection from the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, for his part, saw an opportunity to alter the strategic balance by placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American coast, thereby countering U.S. missiles already stationed in Turkey and Italy near Soviet borders. This decision led directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War and perhaps the closest the world has ever come to nuclear annihilation. When American reconnaissance aircraft discovered Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba, Kennedy was confronted with an unprecedented dilemma: how to remove the missiles without triggering a nuclear war. The crisis forced him to balance military pressure with diplomatic restraint, domestic political expectations with global responsibility, and moral considerations with strategic calculations. Kennedy assembled a group of advisors, known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or ExComm, which debated a wide range of options, including a full-scale invasion of Cuba, targeted airstrikes on the missile sites, secret negotiations, or a naval blockade. Each option carried enormous risks. An invasion could kill Soviet personnel in Cuba and provoke a military response in Europe. Airstrikes might miss some missiles and still trigger retaliation. Negotiations might be seen as weakness and allow the Soviet Union to complete the deployment. Kennedy ultimately chose a naval quarantine, a carefully chosen term intended to avoid the legal implications of a blockade, to prevent further Soviet shipments of offensive weapons to Cuba, while giving diplomacy a chance to work. This decision reflected Kennedy's growing maturity as a leader, shaped by earlier failures and by a deep awareness of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war. Throughout the crisis, Kennedy maintained public calm while privately grappling with fear, uncertainty, and the weight of responsibility for the fate of millions of lives. His leadership style combined firmness with flexibility, strength with caution, and a willingness to listen to dissenting voices within his administration. The Cuban Missile Crisis thus became not only a test of military and diplomatic strategy, but also a profound test of Kennedy's character and judgment as a statesman in a nuclear age. As the crisis unfolded over 13 tense days in October 1962, the world watched anxiously while the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of war. Kennedy announced the discovery of the missiles to the American public and declared the naval quarantine, signaling both resolve and a desire to avoid immediate violence. Soviet ships approaching Cuba slowed, altered course, or stopped, indicating that Khrushchev was willing to pause and reconsider, rather than rush into confrontation. Behind the scenes, a complex and delicate exchange of messages began between Washington and Moscow. Khrushchev sent letters to Kennedy, offering to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba, and later adding a demand that the United States also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy and his advisors recognized that Khrushchev's two letters reflected internal Soviet debates and political pressures, and they carefully crafted a response that publicly accepted the first proposal while privately agreeing to the second. This dual-track diplomacy allowed both leaders to save face. Khrushchev could claim that he had secured Cuba's safety, and Kennedy could claim that he had forced the removal of Soviet missiles from the Western Hemisphere without appearing to yield to blackmail. The crisis was thus resolved not through military victory, but through compromise, communication, and mutual recognition of shared vulnerability. The episode revealed that despite ideological hostility, rational calculation and human caution could still prevail at the highest levels of power. For Kennedy, the crisis marked a turning point in his understanding of the Cold War. He became more skeptical of purely military solutions and more committed to arms control, dialogue, and the gradual reduction of nuclear risks. This shift was reflected in his subsequent actions, including the signing of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963 and his famous American University speech in which he called for a re-examination of attitudes toward the Soviet Union and for a strategy of peace. The Cuban Missile Crisis also reshaped the structure of international relations by highlighting the dangers of miscommunication and by leading to the establishment of the Washington-Moscow hotline to allow direct contact between the superpowers in future emergencies. At the same time, the crisis had profound effects on Cuba, which remained isolated and under U.S. embargo, and on the broader Cold War, which entered a phase sometimes described as détente, characterized by cautious cooperation alongside continuing rivalry. Yet the crisis also demonstrated how fragile peace was in a nuclear world and how much depended on the decisions of a few individuals at critical moments. Kennedy's ability to resist pressure from military leaders who favored aggressive action and Khrushchev's willingness to accept a humiliating retreat were both essential to the avoidance of disaster. The Cuban Missile Crisis thus stands as a powerful reminder that history is not only shaped by structures and forces but also by human choices, emotions, fears, and ethical considerations. It reveals the extent to which leadership in the modern world requires not only strength, but also restraint, empathy, and an awareness of the interconnectedness of all humanity in the face of shared existential threats. The legacy of John F. Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about nuclear weapons, international security, and political leadership. The crisis has become a central case study in diplomacy, crisis management, and decision-making under pressure, taught in universities and military academies around the world as an example of both how close humanity has come to catastrophe and how catastrophe can be avoided. Kennedy is often remembered not simply for standing firm against Soviet aggression, but for choosing a path that left room for his adversary to retreat without humiliation, thereby reducing the incentive for desperate or reckless action. This aspect of his leadership is perhaps his most enduring contribution, the recognition that in a nuclear age, victory cannot be defined in traditional military terms, but must be understood as the preservation of life, stability, and the possibility of future cooperation. The Cuban Missile Crisis also exposed the moral dimension of political power, forcing leaders to confront the reality that their decisions could mean the survival or destruction of entire populations. Kennedy's reflections after the crisis suggest that he was deeply affected by this realization and increasingly committed to preventing similar confrontations in the future. His assassination in November 1963 cut short a presidency that many believe was moving toward a more peaceful and cooperative approach to global politics, and it left open the question of how his policies might have evolved had he lived longer. Nevertheless, the example he set during the Cuban Missile Crisis continues to influence how later leaders think about nuclear deterrence, arms control, and the management of international crises. The crisis also serves as a warning about the dangers of secrecy, escalation, and ideological rigidity, showing how quickly a chain of events can spiral beyond control when states rely solely on power and fear, rather than on dialogue and understanding. In this sense, the story of John F. Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis is not only a historical episode but a timeless lesson about the responsibilities of leadership in a world where technological power has outpaced moral wisdom. It reminds us that peace is not simply the absence of war but the result of continuous effort, communication, and ethical commitment, and that the survival of humanity may depend on the capacity of its leaders to place common survival above national pride, political advantage, or ideological triumph.